Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Morning Gym Poetry. We just had a cold front pass through western Pennsylvania last night, and after a brief heat wave for 3 days last week, the high today should not be more than 74 degrees. And when I woke up this morning, it was a chilly 50. It is a little windy, unusual for western PA, but that's what weather fronts do, don't they? I'm inspired to do a lot of things today, so I'm going to start with a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier titled The Kansas Emigrants. I'll get into why I'm reading this a little bit later. The Kansas Emigrants. We crossed the prairie as of old the pilgrims crossed the sea, to make the west, as they the east, the homestead of the free. We go to rear a wall of men on freedom's southern line, and plant beside the cotton tree the rugged northern pine. We're flowing from our native hills as our free rivers flow. The blessing of our motherland is on us as we go. We go to plant her common schools on distant prairie swells, and give the Sabbaths of the wild the music of her bells. Upbearing, like the ark of old, the Bible in our van, we go to test the truth of God against the fraud of man. No pause, nor rest, save where the streams that feed the Kansas run, save where our pilgrim gonfalon shall flout the setting sun. We'll tread the prairies as of old our fathers sailed the sea, and make the west, as they the east, the homestead of the free. Whittier was one of the 18th century poets that I like to call school book poets, because when I used to look at my father's textbooks from public schools in the first 10 years of the 20th century, they all contained a lot of these poets, including Longfellow, Whittier, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and others. To a lesser degree, these same poets were in my school books as well. They are out of favor now, but we should at least listen to what they had to say. And as you can tell from the Kansas Emigrants by John Greenleaf Whittier, that poem was a very strong abolitionist poem. And Whittier himself was a very strong abolitionist. The poems that he's the most famous for do not include this one. This was a propaganda poem, let's face it. Back then, poets were published in newspapers and were much more influential in shaping public thought about current events. I mentioned long ago in one of these programs how the poem Old Ironsides was highly influential in saving the USS Constitution, vessel that fought in the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War from destruction. So if you think about the years from 1854 to 1863 or earlier, 60, 61, the Civil War attitudes in the North and the South were building at that time. And large groups of New Englanders moved to Kansas to vote for it to be a free state, because it was a close call at that time whether the new states were going to be considered slave states or free states. Whittier, of course, was a strong abolitionist, as I say, and you can hear the freedom propaganda in the poem. Here's another poem, totally unrelated, which I wrote about a year ago, but it has a historical theme, so in that sense it is related. And I wrote it after I read a lengthy discussion of, and it was actually a book about George Washington's slave chef. And his name was Hercules. This poem is called Hercules, His Story. And as I said, he was the enslaved chef belonging to George Washington. This poem is in two parts, and here's part one. 1790. His Excellency brought me to Philadelphia to cook for him, having let go the other cook who did not prepare food to his preferences, or that of the Custis Chillins who lived with them. You know, the kids that called me first Uncle Harkless. The step-grandson, he said I was a celebrated artiste. I made my son Richmond and some others rub everything in the kitchen till it shined bright like polished silver. Now for eatin' His Excellency and Mrs. Washington never spared a shillin' and had the best, so that them important people from the North or the French shouldn't complain about the fare they ate here. And I didn't complain neither, 'cause I got rich selling the slops from our fancy table. Some of the freedmen in Philadelphia called me a dandy because I had tailor-made clothes, and my slops was bringing in $200 a year. You ask, what did I cook for President Washington and his family? Well, the president. His favorite thing was not fancy. It was hoe cakes for breakfast, smothered with butter and honey, and the president liked to wash them down with tea or hot chocolate. But for parties, and we had lots of those in Philadelphia, we had, for the mains, roasted pigs and boiled lamb's legs, roasted fowls, beef, and vegetables such as lettuces, cucumbers, and artichokes. And then we'd have bread, and always a selection of fresh jams and jellies. For the second, we'd have tea, iced creams, tarts, fresh plums and pears, and plenty of dried fruits and nuts. Part 2, 1796. I agreed to return to Mount Vernon every 6 months while I was working in Philadelphia, 'cause Mr. Lear said that slaves would be free if they spent 6 months or more in Pennsylvania. But I was making good money, and the President and Mrs. Washington were most happy with my work. So I went back sometimes to cook, but then them Negro girls were cooking at Mount Vernon. I was having to do common labor, hard stuff like breaking rock, digging ditches. Ain't no kind of work for the president's chef. And no wearing my dandy new clothes either, and no slops to sell. So I skedaddled. I was popular with lots of people in Philadelphia and had plenty of work. Freedom seemed strange. They never found me, even though there was a big reward. But the Quaker white folks were strong against slavery. There ain't nothing better than freedom, I can tell you. No more slavery for Hercules. I make my own way. Tobias Lear was Washington's secretary and would have been the one who communicated with Hercules on any and all subjects. Let's see what my notes say here. Oh, yeah. Washington freed most of his slaves when he died. Some were inherited by family members, but most of them got their freedom. But like Thomas Jefferson, who died much later, Washington was a man of his times. I don't think we can criticize him for being like everybody else. Even though he showed us in many of his actions that he was way ahead of his times when it came to the subject of freedom, at least for the settlers in the New World. So Washington was not able to exist, it seems, without slave labor. But in Quaker Philadelphia, the first U.S. capital, there existed a large colony of freed slaves who had their own community. And many of them worked for the Quaker gentry and other gentry that lived in Philadelphia. And that included a lot of fancy cookery jobs for Hercules after he escaped. I'm not sure people today fully understand the complexity of life in colonial times. Okay, that's it for today. And I think, as you'll see, I'm going to bring in the poetry of Oliver Wendell Holmes and some of the other early 19th century American poets as we go along over this summer, culminating perhaps right around the 4th of July. That's still a very important date for this country, isn't it? I think so. Bye now.